Hello. Hey, hey, beautiful Bitcoin people. How you guys doing? Ready for lunch? Yeah. Thank you, very much for the introduction. Like I said, I've been in the Bitcoin space for quite some time. I began working on some of the software. I've had a lot of discussions with people about the economic principles behind Bitcoin and how we're going to develop that moving forward, right? It's not a closed discussion here. And I spent a lot of time on the internet, talking to guys like Peter Simon and Peter Schiff, right? Two bearded Peters, as I like to call them. And they have very strong opinions. These aren't dumb guys. They've been in the economic space for a while, and they have a really deep understanding of their respective, their domains of knowledge. And so when they say things like it's a hot dumpster fire, those of you who are on the Organs podcast, or just type machine from your ship, you have to wonder, these guys are not complete idiots. What is it that they know that we don't, right? We should always take our critics seriously and try to better understand them. So I tried to dig a little bit deeper and learn a little bit about Peter Schiff and his views. So one popular sentiment that Peter likes to echo is that gold has an intrinsic value, right? Maybe some of you have heard this talking point before, right? And he goes even further to say that money and Bitcoin do not have this problem, right? And to some degree, he's right. But as far as intrinsic value itself, if we take a look at Peter, he is actually a member of the Mises Institute. He has a profile right on their page. And he claims to be an adherent of Austrian economics, right? How many Austrian economists we got here? Anybody? Show of hands. Oh wow, not that many. Okay, so a lot of Bitcoin's core foundational values came from the principles that the Austrian economists talked about and developed over time. And so Peter Schiff, being a adherent to those principles, I had to ask why. Why would he think that something like gold's intrinsic value would be important for it to be a monetary system when the Austrians themselves base their theory on the subjective theory of value, which states that all things do not have intrinsic value rather to be a monetary system, rather they have subjective value, and that is the value that we assign to them, right? In fact, a prominent Austrian economist, Gary North, he said the following: conservatives appreciate the fact of gold's historic value, but they mistakenly argue their case in terms of gold's intrinsic value, right? And this is very much Peter Schiff's argument, which goes against the grain. So again, we have to try to understand what is it that's driving Peter Schiff to make these arguments that go against the very basic tenets of his own professed ideology, right? So I thought about this a little bit, and then I ran across this study. This was done in 2014. It was a survey. 26% of US respondents do not realize that the Earth revolves around the sun. Is anybody surprised by that? Right? So maybe I have a couple European friends out here, so maybe they're smirking. It's just the US education system. Well, apparently they did better than the EU residents on the question about that, of whether the Earth moves around the sun. So Europeans still think that the sun circles the Earth. Well, at least some percentage of them, right? And many people, it's interesting. The more you talk to people and the more you try to convince people of things, the more you realize that people hold these beliefs that seem very counterintuitive to us, but to them seem very intuitive. And so most of us here are probably heliocentrists, right? Any geocentrists? No, not a single one. Okay, that's interesting. That's good. So we as heliocentrists, right, we all think Copernicus was right, right? Does everybody think Copernicus? Everybody here pro Copernicus? Yes, okay, we have a Copernicus fan. Great, well, oh, sorry, a little too fast here. So for the Copernicus fans, here's the interesting thing about Copernicus. It wasn't very successful, his model, right? So his brilliant insight was that the planets go in circles around the sun. Well, the fact of the matter is they don't actually move in circles, rather they move in ellipses. And it wasn't until Kepler came around that we had that insight. Now, why is that important? I mean, a circle and ellipses, what's the difference? Well, it turns out that under Copernicus's ideas, which were correct directionally, nevertheless, the old models with the Earth at the center of the universe might have been complicated, but they were still better at predicting where things would be in the sky.
right? So this should give us pause, because if we think about Bitcoin as a Copernican style advancement, right, where we've had this great new insight into how things should operate, the question we should be asking ourselves is it enough to be better than the current economic models that exist, right? And here's a little vignette to kind of push the point a little bit further between a teacher and a student. So the student asks the teacher, or remarks to the teacher, those primitive people, they were so stupid to think that the sun goes around the earth. Yes, remarks the teacher, just imagine how it would have looked if that were true, right? So imagine, you're sitting in El Salvador, on your farm, and you look up at the sky and you see the sun going around in a circle. What does that look like to you? Right? And you base your entire farming schedule and build rituals around that, right? And as far as you're concerned, the sun is going around the earth, and all your models work, right? All right. So, given that, let's try to understand how Bitcoin fits into the existing models and theories that people have, right? Like these farmers. Why should these farmers change their views? So, up till now, historically, there have been three general theories of money. The commodity theory of money, starting from, I guess it would be right to left, the commodity theory of money, the fiat theory of money, and the credit theory of money. These are fundamentally, they cover pretty much 99% of economic theories that exist today. However, no theory is capable of providing a coherent and conclusive account of the nature of money. Okay? But at the same time, each of these capture a dimension of money. The thing that we have to ask ourselves is, how does Bitcoin fit into these theories and into these systems? Because it has to interact with them. Not only that, we also have to think about how we convince other people of Bitcoin's um, value proposition, right? There's a saying in startup culture that in order for a product to be successful, it can't just be better, it has to be 10 times better than the existing product, because there's a cost to switch, all right? All right, so let's take a look. So commodity theory of value, AKA gold for most people. The problem of money systems which realize the ideas of commodity theory of money by connecting the value of money to gold is that ultimately they come up against a paradox, and that is gold is priceless. If gold is the standard against which all other commodities are priced, how do we price gold itself, right? So the commodity theory of value says that you have some sort of commodity and you use that as the basis for trading amongst a lot of other different things. But the thing that it struggles with is to understand what is the actual value of the commodity itself. Take a kind of a contrived example, and there's a lot of problems with this, but this will kind of get the juices flowing and get you guys thinking about this. Is imagine, there are two people on an island. One guy has a bunch of coconuts, one guy has a piece of gold. The guy with the piece of gold really wants the coconut, and he's willing to trade his piece of gold for the coconut. The guy with a bunch of coconuts, he's like, man, I got too many coconuts. I wonder if I can get that guy's piece of gold. I'll give him 2 coconuts. The question here is, how many coconuts is that piece of gold worth? Is it worth 1 coconut, or is it worth 2 coconuts? Right? There's no objective standard. Whichever side makes the initial offer will probably set the price, right? And so the point here being is that with the commodity theory of value, one thing that is a paradox and very difficult to wrap your head around is that the thing that you're trading with is really valueless. It's more of a unit of measure. And so what is it that makes gold so special? Right? So really quickly, the impossibility of adequately accounting for the value of gold gives rise to the imaginary fantasy of gold as being endowed with some special form of intrinsic value between the ordinary sphere of use value, right? This is Peter Schiff's argument over and over again, and a lot of guys like him, right? But perhaps the value of commodity is not derived from the value of gold, but the other way around. The reason why gold is so valuable is not that it has intrinsic value, but because it is endowed with a special limiting function in relation to money. In other words, you can't make more of it, all right? So there's a limit, a physical limit to how much gold is there. And what is the value of just having that physical limit? Well, the value of that is that it's a reliable way of measuring measuring things in value uh, in the absence of an objective standard for value, right? And so how does Bitcoin fit into this picture? Well, Bitcoin is based on the same kind of negative symbolism. Rather than pretending that the money is structured around some positive entity guaranteeing the value of the entire symbolic order, right, like the London Gold Exchange setting some price, Bitcoin openly admits to being structured around a pure lack of intrinsic value. And again, this is by design. There's nobody setting the price of Bitcoin. It's just a placeholder. But here's the key. Although there are no precious metals or any kind of value underlying Bitcoin, the currency is still a finite resource. And again, this is where it's like gold. In fact, George Selgin, he refers to Bitcoin as a synthetic commodity money to capture this feature. So again, what Bitcoin shares with gold is that it's limited, only 21 million, right? Same thing with gold. There's only so many ounces out there in the Earth's crust that we can mine. And that is a useful property. Now, where do they differ? Where does Bitcoin improve on gold, right? And the difference between the two is, of course, that unlike gold, Bitcoin is not physical, and that gives it a unique set of properties, right? You don't have to deal with the difficulties of dealing with something that's physical, making it easier to verify, making it easier to transport, making it easier to hide, right? These are all important qualities. And so when you're debating with gold bugs like Peter Schiff, it's very important to keep this context in mind because most of his arguments will be refuted within this kind of framework, right? Now, here's a question. So what would Peter Schiff say to this, right? Again, we want to give our opponents the benefit of the doubt. Well, he would say, well, sure, look, Bitcoin may be limited to 21 million, but why can't you just change the code, right? And so we come to our next general theory of money, which is the fiat theory of money. And the fiat theory of money says that money is ultimately the creation of the state or other sovereign entity. A classic formulation is the theory found in George Knapp's The State Theory of Money, where he states, money is a creature of law. The soul of currency is not in the material of the pieces, but in the legal ordinances which regulate their use, right? Hopefully this has some of you thinking, well, how does that relate? Well, here's how it works for the state that creates the fiat standard. The idea is, on one hand, the state produces certain objects that are legally designated as money. With the other hand, the state demands the very same objects as payments of taxes, duties, fines, and other kinds of debt from the citizens of the state, right? And through this creation of supply and demand, you create an economy of, in our case, dollars circulating, and then those become useful for other economic transactions. So again, how does Bitcoin fit into this? Well, Bitcoin is radically different from fiat money issued by the state. Nevertheless, Bitcoin still shares characteristics with the idea of money found in fiat theory. Bitcoin has value as money not only insofar as there's a community of users, or it has value as money only insofar as there is a community of users willing to accept and hold Bitcoin in exchange for commodities, services, and other forms of money. Right? Bitcoin is a claim upon a society of users willing to follow its consensus rules and thus functions as a fiat money without a state. Right? So Bitcoin, very much just like other fiat systems, relies on consensus and rules. Right? That is a fundamental feature of it. Now, what are the advantages of that? Why would a state want control over the rules of the money system? Right? Well, because the state is ultimately responsible for the regulation of the economy. And in order to do that, it has to be able to control some of the variables that go into the monetary system that make up that economy. Likewise with Bitcoin, what value do we have in having a programmatic currency? What is it that makes it so special? Unlike gold, by the way, which can't be changed unless somebody can change the laws of physics, right? Well, the special property of being dynamic is that Bitcoin can change over time as necessary, right? So Bitcoin gives us the ability to adjust as needs arise, right? So there are some people that think maybe quantum computing will make the mining algorithm obsolete. Well, in that case, Bitcoin can adjust. On the other hand, if gold, all of a sudden somebody figures out how to, figures out the secret of alchemy and is able to make a lot of gold, or Elon Musk goes and his rockets work incredibly well and captures an asteroid full of gold, all of a sudden you have wild inflation with gold, right? How's that for a joke, right? So Bitcoin has this property of fiat money, which is very useful. But at the same time, it's not beholden to the limitations of a particular nation state. It's the first attempt at a global consensus. All right, so what we've talked about so far is interesting, but these are mostly forms of money that none of us ever see. On day to day, maybe not in this room, but even in this room, most of us use what? Credit. The final and the most powerful theory of how money is created and managed, and that is credit. And the standard reference for this is Alfred Innes, who says, credit and credit alone is money. A sale and purchase is the exchange of a commodity or service for a credit. Okay? However, not all money is, while all money is debt, the converse is not necessarily true. All debt is not money. So we understand that money is debt, right? Because when you have a dollar bill, when you have a gold coin, when you have anything, it's it's a debt that somebody has to repay. You can exchange that later for a good or a service, right? Somebody is indebted to you in exchange for that thing. So that is true. But as far as the debt itself, it's not money, right? The obligation is not money. And the way we see this is, for debt to become money, it must be able to circulate at a constant nominal value among the members of an economic community, right? In other words, a $1,000 credit on a beggar does not hold the same value as a $1,000 credit on a billionaire. Which one is more likely to actually be traded at par, right? Anybody who's ever loaned money to friends is very familiar with this concept. So how do we organize this? In order to ensure that credit can be used as money in our modern system, banks must stand out as the ultimate or even sublime creditors in the economy, which means that their debts have to be accepted in payments at no discount from their nominal value. Right? $1,000 in the bank buys you exactly $1,000 worth of commodities, no matter how bad the investments are on that bank's balance sheet, right? Because what happens if they screw up? What happened traditionally? They went bust, right? People would lose money. But now, that's no longer the case. Now, if a bank goes bust, they're bailed out by the government. And it's exactly for this reason, because in order to sustain a credit money system, the debt must be valued at par. And those that issue the debt must be seen as sublime. So, when a commercial bank makes a loan of $1,000, it does not have to pay out the loan in cash, gold, or some other form of money. In return for the loan, the bank simply credits the borrower's account, and now this newly issued credit may itself function as money. Right? If anybody's taken out a home loan, anything like that, they know that you don't get a bag of cash. You just get the number in your account changed to some arbitrary value. And given the extensive electronic payment system today, this credit money also does not need to be converted into cash or central bank reserves in order to function as payment. Again, anybody that uses a credit card is very familiar with this. You just swipe the card, and all it is just a record of a transaction with some nominal value. There is nothing underlying any of that other than the bank's guarantee that that debt will be honored one-to-one. Hello? Oh, we lost our slides. There we go. Okay. Whoa. Is that right? I'm still not working, but we'll go with this. Okay. So credit money is most often purely virtual. Oh, whoa. Sorry. There we go. Right. Right, so credit cards, so stay with me. So credit cards and loans, right? So these things, they're valued as is, even though there's nothing really underlying them except maybe the asset. But so fundamentally, our contemporary money system may be understood as a combination of two different kinds of money. One, fiat money in the form of physical cash or central bank reserves. This is what most people think of when they think of money. That's held in commercial bank account with the central bank, right? This is stuff you deposit when you deposit your paycheck, etc. And then the second type, which is credit money in the form of deposits in private money users' current accounts with commercial banks. So this is the stuff when you get loans or maybe the paycheck that you get is a direct deposit, right? All of that stuff is virtual. It doesn't exist other than on the ledgers and the balance sheets of the banks. The difference between the two kinds of money is at the heart of what's so-called the fractional reserve banking system, which allows private commercial banks to create new credit money as they lend this money to customers, right? And the paradox of fractional reserve banking is that on the one hand, commercial bank credit money circulates at the same value as the state-issued fiat money, so $1 equals $1, even if it's a virtual number in your bank account. But on the other hand, the amount of outstanding credit money vastly exceeds the amount of fiat money on reserve in the bank. Right, so I'm sure most people here are familiar with fractional reserve banking, and that allows the banks to loan money into existence and only have to maintain some nominal reserve to account for any potential issues. Right, and that's because they just assume that the banks are going to make loans that will always be repaid one-to-one. Right? How often has that been proven true? Not very often, right? So that creates kind of an issue in that the banks are able to create this money, but they're not backing it up with 100% guarantee, right? There may be a house as an asset, but if that house goes down in value, who's going to make up the difference, right? And the answer is the people, the community. They'll be bailed out by the government, and there will be a tax on the people for the gains of private banks and private individuals who made bad decisions, right? That's not very good. That's a form of moral hazard, and the more that happens, the more it can feed on itself. This creates a lot of the situations we saw, like the 2009 financial crisis, where mortgages were valued at a certain level and treated as cash, but it turned out when those mortgages were not valued correctly, it created a cascade of problems for people who depended on those mortgages being valued at par. Right? So this is the weakness of credit money. So the question then is, what is the strength of credit money? Why even have this thing if it's so volatile, right? Why are governments so infatuated with it, right? And that is because credit equals growth. So the way that a government juices an economy is by pumping credit into it. It gets people to do things, right? People will take loans, they'll make things, they'll build things, they'll start companies. That's great. But people will also make mistakes. They'll have malinvestment. They'll have businesses that fail, right? And all these things need to be accounted for. And in theory, the banks are dealing with this and being good stewards of this. But in reality, their incentive is just to make the loans, because if they make a mistake, they get bailed out. Right? And so again, credit money is most often purely virtual and is nothing but a recording of the relation between the creditor and the debtor in a bookkeeping system. And we can easily recognize where Bitcoin fits in, because Bitcoin is very similar. At the core is the blockchain, which functions as a public ledger registering the credits of the money users in the system. The value of a particular Bitcoin wallet corresponds to the credit recorded in the blockchain. Very simple, right? These Bitcoins don't exist in any sense. They're just a recording of some nominal credit that somebody has with the Bitcoin ecosystem. Right? When people often hear about Bitcoin for the first time, they're often puzzled by the way the system seems to create new money out of nothing. Right? It's perhaps even more curious that we readily accept the creation of new money out of nothing by the conventional commercial bank system. At least with Bitcoin, it's not parasitic on the nation state and its currency. If Bitcoin fails, right, the difference between Bitcoin and the conventional bank credit money is that new Bitcoins are created and introduced into the economy free of debt. When Bitcoins are generated, there is no underlying promise of debt. Whereas the commercial bank, when they issue new credit to circulate as money, the opposite side of that is the customer's debt to the bank account, right? And so Bitcoin does not represent a claim on any particular debtor. There's not somebody that owes you something for your Bitcoin. Rather, it's on the entire ecosystem. So the entire ecosystem of Bitcoin is what will honor that credit. And it's a key distinction. It seems like it's something trivial, but it's very key, because there is no bad debt in Bitcoin. The only way that Bitcoin debt fails is if the entire system collapses. But even under that situation, it only affects those people using that system. And it's not forced or coerced upon any group of people, right? This is all voluntary, guys. So finally, all forms of money come with their own forms of exploitation, risks, and even violence. But once a certain form of money has become fully integrated into the general economic structure of society, we seem to accept these forms of exploitation, risk, violence, and as something that's inevitable and even natural. And when you talk to people, you'll hear this a lot. You know, this is the way it is. It's worked for hundreds, thousands of years. You know, it's just the way it is. You have to accept it. And Bitcoin, on top of all that, is the worst form of money. And we should listen to the critics, the central banks and other financial authorities, when they come out to warn us against Bitcoin. Users are at risk of losing their money. Yes, I know people that have lost money on Bitcoin, right? Whether it be in the value changing or losing the keys to their wallet. This is a real risk, right? It could be used for illicit purposes, drug dealing, tax evasion, money laundering. These are all fantastic use cases for Bitcoin, right? Free Ross, by the way. Yeah. So yes, they're right. They're also right, and the socialists will come out, and they'll be coming out of the woodwork sooner than you think. They'll say early adopters are seeing huge profits as the price of Bitcoin multiplies, potentially creating a wealth inequality, a Bitcoin aristocracy. They've recreated that which they hate. It's a legitimate criticism. Bitcoin does nothing to address wealth inequality.
But wait, don't throw tomatoes yet. All of these points of criticism apply equally and perhaps even more pertinently to our current forms of conventional money. It is hardly controversial to suggest that our existing system of money, banking and finance already contains elements of the Ponzi scheme, the small minority of agents and institutions favorably placed to take profitable advantage of the rest of the people in the system. We know this all too well. The critiques against Bitcoin almost resemble a form of Freudian projection, where the deficiencies of conventional money are ascribed to Bitcoin. So what we need to do is we need to separate the arguments that have to do with money and what Bitcoin brings to the table from arguments which have nothing to do with money and have more to do with social and political structures. So, let's real quick recap and we're done. So what did we learn today? Gold, that Bitcoin is the type of gold money, commodity money without gold. In other words, the physicality of gold. That's progress. We learned that Bitcoin is a sort of fiat money that takes some of the advantages of being dynamic and adjustable without having any kind of state backing. That's progress. Right? We bring more people into the fold into making a consensus around what the economic system should be. Number 3, we learned that Bitcoin is a form of credit money. It's a form of credit money that does not implicitly put debt on individuals and banks. It does not allow anyone to even profit from that. Right? With the exception of the miners, we allow miners as a bootstrapping mechanism, but again, that will go away. When that goes away, there's no debt that is generated that can be siphoned off the system and lent out without due diligence. Right? Because if you lend Bitcoin, you have to lend the Bitcoin itself. And so if you lose that Bitcoin, it's on you. And that is a much better system because it prevents moral hazard in creating systems like we have now where the banks have created these derivative structures that have to be maintained and balanced constantly. So knowing all this and realizing that Bitcoin doesn't fix everything, as people would like to tell you. There are some problems it can't fix that we have to fix for political or social or other means. Nevertheless, it's progress. And it may be that we are in a Copernicus moment where we have discovered something truly revolutionary and insightful. But we may also be waiting for our Kepler to come along and to refine it to the point where it's viable, it's 10x viable. Nevertheless, to wrap up, again, the last slide. Our analysis of Bitcoin can thus be summarized by a paraphrase of Winston Churchill's famous remark about democracy. Bitcoin is the worst form of money, except for all others. Thank you, everyone.